I'm Chris Bartell. I'm a professor of, associate professor of social studies education here at UMass Boston in the College of Education and Human Development.
And I'm Nick Jurovich. I'm an assistant professor of history and labor studies here at UMass Boston in the College of Liberal Arts.
We'll talk loud. You got to talk close to that mic.
Yes.
And so we're going to start with a real brief kind of overview of the long history of attempts to integrate the Boston public schools and what the role of desegregation busing was in that longer story, which should take only maybe about 10-15 minutes, and then we're going to have the panel come up and ask them a series of questions about how they're approaching this in their classrooms in the Boston public schools, or how the Healy Library helps support teachers around that. And then we will end with the audience having some questions. So we do have some microphones, so at that point we'll be walking around the microphone so people can ask questions. So let's talk a little bit about the history of integration and desegregation in the Boston public schools. So I think you lead here.
Let me also, volume a little better now? Yes. Excellent, excellent. Let me also make sure to thank Chris Bartell, who really was the engine behind this event, and also the College of Education and Human Development for their support of this event. Also want to thank Lou Finfer and the Boston Desegregation and Busing Initiative for co-sponsoring, helping promote it. And our Labor Resource Center. We did a bit of promotion as well, but also wanted to note that we have an upcoming event this Saturday where we will be picking up on this history, focusing on the December 14, 1974 Say No to Racism March, organized to respond to the racist attacks on children and educators desegregating the public schools. So I'll say a little more about that, but there's more to come on this. Also want to thank our speakers and everyone for attending. Well, I'm going to talk a little about the history right now, but I'm also very mindful that in any room in Boston, there is an enormous amount of knowledge about this history and also a lot of experience. And so what I want to introduce is a very brief set of ideas and sort of touch points that I use when I work on this history with my students who themselves bring this knowledge into the classroom. So this is meant to tee up some ideas, some conversations. It's not comprehensive. We don't have time for that. And it's also not meant to be authoritative. But enough preamble. We wanted to start by emphasizing that this is not a history that just lives in the 1970s, that there is a long, long history both of segregation and racism in Boston, but also of black organizing to defeat it. And wanted to start going, as we say here, more than 2 centuries back to the creation of Boston's African Free School, not yet 1800, by Prince Hall and others, to create an educational space for black Bostonians and their children. This school evolves, and I'm not going to go through every bullet point, into the Smith School, which is itself a segregated school in a time when the northern cities that had schools for black children had segregated schools. So this image here at the bottom is from Philadelphia. And it's this school to which young Sarah Roberts is supposed to attend in 1849 when she tries to enroll at the school closer to her house and is turned away as a kindergartner, right? Literally thrown out of the school. And her father, and I have the caption wrong here, her father is Benjamin Roberts. He works with the attorney Robert Morris, who is pictured there, one of the first black Bostonians to argue at the bar, and the well-known abolitionist Charles Sumner to bring a case asserting the rights of black Bostonians to equal education. The court finds against it, finds for the school, and introduces the phrase separate but equal into U.S. law. Now the story doesn't stop there, thankfully. Black abolitionists and their white allies in Boston continue to organize, and by 1855 have secured a law outlawing segregation in Massachusetts schools. But laws, of course, do not solve problems. They merely set new terrain for struggle. And as we sort of look forward into the 19th and early 20th centuries, there may not be well-known touch points for school desegregation, but there is a long black radical tradition and organizing tradition in Boston, which has been documented by many great black historians. So you see some books here. I always love to put up book titles. I'm not going to go into detail on any of these. They're all excellent. But this tradition of organizing, which includes William Monroe Trotter's efforts to protest the screening of Birth of a Nation in Boston, which include organizing on the waterfront by Mel King's parents, among others, as well as Don't Buy Where You Can't Work campaigns, form what King called the chain of change, right? The organizing tradition in Boston, of which desegregation was a part. And to kind of bring us up into that moment when desegregation becomes a prominent part of the organizing landscape, I'm sure many of you all are familiar with the growth of Boston's black population during and after the Second World War as part of what's sometimes called the Second Great Migration. And also the baby boom, right, which brings millions of children into public schools, and thousands in Boston, and makes them a site of struggle anew. And this then is fueled by the Brown v. Board decision. And I want to be clear that this decision does not desegregate schools, right? It really sets a new terrain in which black families, black children desegregate schools, often at great cost, right? And so you see pictured here Ruth Batson, when she goes to the local NAACP and asks whether they have organizing around desegregation in public schools, she's told, not yet, but we'd love it if you'd get on it. And so she becomes the director of their education committee. She's here talking to Senator Ed Brooke. And here she is, we're gonna play a clip, talking about why this struggle was central to her organizing and to the organizing of so many black Bostonians in this immediate post-war era.
Louise Day Hicks, South Boston lawyer, chairperson of the school committee, said to Mrs. Batson, "Mrs. Batson, we don't segregate the schools. We only assign students to schools closest to where they live. So we're not accepting this notion, and we are not going to do anything about what you're talking about."
We made our presentation and everything broke loose. We were completely rejected that night, and we left battle-scarred.
If an American, because his skin is dark, cannot eat lunch in a restaurant open to the public, if he cannot send his children to the best public school available, if he cannot vote, who among us would then be content with the counsels of patience and delay?
So here you've got President Kennedy making an impassioned speech to the nation in this morally rich position that he's taking, juxtaposed with the Boston School Committee, which is presented with this opportunity. And it does exactly the opposite. Dug its heels in.
This meeting is a turning point. It ignited a movement. The civil rights movement came to Boston on June 11th, 1963.
So, with the changes that started to occur after Brown versus Board of Education, some of the earliest changes were led by the black community here in Boston. I'm not going to go through each of these events, but I'll highlight some of the more important ones. So there's a school boycott that is done within the black community of Boston to demand desegregation. Not long after, Martin Luther King comes to Boston and leads a march from what today is Nubian Square to Boston Common. And then, again, Massachusetts legislature does respond by passing a law, but that, again, laws don't fix the problems, as Nick had said earlier. So black parents continue to organize in Boston to do whatever they can to provide an equitable learning experience. Some of those include Ellen Jackson, who founds Operation Exodus, trying to bus black students to other schools in the system. Around the same time, METCO is created to bus students from Boston out to predominantly white suburbs. And then the Roxbury Community School is created. And here's an image of Martin Luther King when he marched for equality in Boston schools, where a crowd of 22,000 came to the bandstand on Boston Common. Here's an image of Ellen Jackson and the Operation Exodus, but it's also a flyer for the Roxbury Community School. And then in 1972, as a court of last resort, the NAACP files suit in the case Morgan versus Hennigan against the Boston School Committee. Here is Judge Garrity, who would be the presiding judge. Nick told me I didn't know what the picture was. So essentially him and his clerks were getting ready to tour the Boston public schools to see the situation on the ground. In June 1974, Judge Garrity rules that the Boston School Committee intentionally segregated Boston's public schools, and per the judge's order, Boston must segregate during their opening of the school year in 1974, which began on September 12th. So we're going to show a little clip about the beginning of that desegregation effort.
The first day of school, my brother and I had bus assignments, and we collected students and other buses to drive up to South Boston High School.
Your old street annex right over here. First 2 buses, please.
I went up to Southie High. There was staging for the television cameras, and the first one I noticed was the BBC. We all knew something was going to happen.
As the kids were getting out the buses, there was a line of police holding back residents from South Boston, screaming at the black students. We were fearful for our lives.
We were not pushing for desegregation because of the Brotherhood of Man concept. Where there were white students, that's where the money went.
How adults in Boston could not have come up with a better plan, it still baffles me.
I'm not for all this. I don't care. My one will not go to school, but it's tearing them apart.
So I'm guessing some of you have seen these images before. These are the most iconic images in some ways of desegregation. The strife, the conflict, the violence on September the 12th of 1974 and in the months that followed. But I do want to emphasize that the process by which that reaction was built was intentional, and it was led by political leaders like Louise Day Hicks, who realized as she was on the school committee that she was winning votes by increasingly opposing the claims and efforts of black Bostonians, right? And so you see here, this is 1963 up top, Ruth Batson presenting for her, right? When she was elected in 61, she did not run on an anti-desegregation platform. But by 65 and 67, when she's the top vote getter in the city, she is explicitly running on a racist platform and is engaging national movements around this, George Wallace and others. And so by the time we get to 74, this has been a project, right? And the thing I want to emphasize as well is that 74 and 75, that school year, is a year of conflict, absolutely. But in addition to the well-known and oft-photographed, oft-remembered anti-busing activism, there is also an enormous amount of organizing to support desegregation and the rights of black Bostonians to self-determination. So this bottom image, perhaps less known, is a march organized by an emergency committee headed by State Senator Bill Owens. It took place on December 14th, 1974. I want to acknowledge Ed Childs, who was there. He'll be speaking at our event on Saturday. And so I want to emphasize that this story, again, is not complete if we remember it only as racist reaction, and if we only center that reaction. So Chris is going to speak a little about legacy, and then I promise we will get out of the way and let you hear from the educators.
Oftentimes the story of busing kind of ends in 1975 in many, especially many classrooms where it's being taught. But there were many changes that happened around desegregation in Boston public schools afterward. Louise Day Hicks ends up not winning re-election after busing, so despite those attempts to kind of garner that as a political tool, it is unsuccessful. She ends up getting appointed because someone resigns, and then she essentially gets back onto the school committee for a brief period of time. But what's important about this story as well is that John D. O'Brien is the first elected black member of the Boston School Committee in 1977, followed not too many years later by Gene McGuire. In the 1980s, 1985, that school committee appoints LaValle Wilson, the first black superintendent of the Boston Public Schools. During that same, in late 1980s, 1989, Boston, once the court order is essentially lifted, Boston moves to what was a system called controlled choice, which sometimes is known as the 3-zone busing system, where parents then could choose schools within 3 large zones. And then, as part of the story as well, is in 1992, through a home rule petition, the elected school committee of Boston is turned into a mayoral appointed school committee, the only community in all of Massachusetts that has an appointed school committee. A lot of times people try to link this to busing, and there's no real direct connection to busing. It happened a decade and a half earlier, right? But in more recent years, Boston has moved towards something that's called the home-based model. And now students can select schools from a much smaller radius from where they live. And there's been some recent studies that show that racial segregation is increasing in the Boston public schools because of the home-based system. So sometimes there's some steps forward and certainly some steps backward. And so in a moment to introduce our panel, we're just going to kind of bring up some big ideas. So why this panel, why today? Of course, it's the 50th, this fall marks the 50th anniversary of the desegregation busing in Boston schools. And this legacy continues. And as Nick had said, we don't want to center the white violence in this conversation, but instead the activism and the movements of black parents, especially in the system. The struggle for integration, quality education continues. Many parent and educator and organizers work today to make the Boston Public Schools a more equitable space. The teachers who are on our panel today are part of that movement for sure. And how we teach about busing in the present is very important. So we hope this panel of Boston Public Schools educators will help provide some insight as to what's happening on the ground in classrooms. And I actually forgot my paper over here, so I need to go get it. So our first panelist is Tanisha Milton. Tanisha is a proud product of the Boston Public Schools. Her children were educated in the Boston Public Schools, and she's dedicated 17 years of her life to teaching in the Boston Public Schools. In 2023, Ms. Milton won the Boston Public Schools Educator of the Year Award. And was one of the first BPS educators to teach AP African American Studies course here in the Boston Public Schools. As a highly energetic and widely celebrated educator, Ms. Milton is known to be a role model for students and teachers, impactful and culturally competent and culturally responsive educator. Nima Avashia, our second presenter, our second panelist, was born and raised in southern West Virginia to parents who immigrated to the United States. She has been a civics and history teacher in the Boston Public Schools since 2003 and is currently serving as an instructional coach at the English High School. She is also the author of Another Appalachia, Coming Up Queer and Indian in a Mountain Place, available in bookstores everywhere. Sadly, Crystal Patterson, who is at the Ruth Batson Academy, recently renamed for the Civil Rights Pioneer, had a family emergency and was unable to, at last minute, unable to attend our panel, but she's here in spirit. And then our last panelist is Andrew Elder. Andrew is the University Archivist and Curator of Special Collections in the Healy Library at UMass Boston. He's also a volunteer activist at the History Project, a community-based archive that documents and preserves Boston's LGBTQ+ history. Andrew is the co-developer of, I'm not sure if it's pronounced ROPA, I should have asked you, sorry, the Roadmap for Participatory Archiving, and his professional and research interests include digital archives, community-based archives, and participatory archiving. So again, please welcome our panelists. First question. So I'm going to move it like this. How do you teach about the desegregation busing era in Boston? What are some of the main themes you organize around? Are there any lessons, activities, media, or sources that you find particularly powerful in relaying this event to your students?
I guess I'll go first. I hate that you guys showed the film at the beginning because I'm like, oh my God, these are all my notes. But I usually approach or begin my unit by guiding students through an extensive study of the civil rights movement. We dig a little deep in examining racial segregation laws, Jim Crow laws, all throughout the country. We learn about how those were practiced. We focus on several different forms of resistance that was used to fight for equality and justice. So students are being exposed to what it means to protest, what it means to march, what it means to boycott things. They learn about different social organizations and most importantly, this idea of being able to build economic, social, and political power. But we intentionally learn about how education was perhaps the main battleground, one of the best strategies that was used in this movement to end Jim Crow. And I just have to make sure I am quoting Ruth Batson when she says, when we fight about education, we are fighting for our lives. So some of the main themes is actually, we start off by learning about the landmark decision of the Brown versus Board of Education. So we explore various ways public schools integrated afterwards. So significant events like the Little Rock Nine, we read excerpts from Warriors Don't Cry. We learn about the courageous story of Ruby Bridges and the 4 other children people never talk about who fought to integrate New Orleans schools in New Orleans. And so I am very intentional in just making sure that I'm providing students with a more deeper understanding of the history. I think some of the powerful sources that I use, I mean, we have to talk about the powerful documentary of Eyes on the Prize. I mean, season 2, Fight Back, it highlights the integration efforts between Little Rock, but I mean, season 7, The Keys of the Kingdom, that literally delves right into the challenges that were faced by Boston Public Schools during desegregation. My students also look at the power of visuals. It made me so happy to see the soiling of Old Glory by Stanley Foreman. I really like to start my lessons off with that because it powerfully illustrates this misconception that a lot of racist acts were only happening in the Deep South. But most of my students are surprised when they realize that this happened in Boston City Hall. So that's sort of kind of some of the things that I use in my classroom.
I can go next. I think, so I taught civics right down the road at the McCormick Middle School, which is now Ruth Batson Academy, for 19 years. And when I taught civics, I think I taught through a similar lens as Tanisha, which is we started with like Michelle Alexander's work around the birth of Jim Crow, and we really looked at sort of the long legacies of racism and white supremacy in this country, and kind of how everything that we were seeing in the context of Boston during busing and Boston now is all rooted in that very long history. But the past 2 years, I actually worked as an ethnic studies coach for BPS, and that caused me to think about this history from a different frame, because the frames of ethnic studies are a little bit different. And a frame that I have been thinking about a lot in the context of this history is the one of self-determination, which is the question that people were trying to answer for so long and continue to try to answer is, what does it mean to have every child in the city of Boston get a quality education? One where they are affirmed, one where they're supported, one where they learn what they need to learn and are equipped with what they need to be equipped with, but that is grounded in the values and beliefs of the community that they're from. And so I've been thinking a lot about what does it mean to teach this history through that frame of self-determination. Because when you do that, it also opens up who you talk about a little bit. Certainly Black organizing around education in Boston is a 2-century endeavor. There are other communities that came to Boston later in the 60s and 70s, the Chinese American community, the Latino community, who also ended up being part of the organizing around schools in the city, who were organizing for bilingual education, who were trying to think about what would it mean for their students to have teachers who understood them and could communicate with them and could care for them and share cultural practices with them. When we think about it through that lens of self-determination, I think it makes for us being able to think about this struggle as a shared struggle for communities of color in this city. And that's been a place, I think, where I found myself interested in thinking about how could we use that to help young people see that that fight around self-determination is actually still the fight today. It's the thing we're still trying to figure out. We've not been able to answer this question of what does it mean to guarantee that every young person in the city gets access to the kind of education that they deserve, and what does it mean for our families and communities to have a say in what the nature of that education is, and to be able to value sort of the things that they value. So that, I think, has been an interesting correction for me, or not correction, but just an interesting reframe for me to think about. And I think in terms of resources, some of the things in the Northeastern Archives are really powerful in that way. They have sort of the community flyers of folks who were involved in the bilingual education efforts. There's a lot of resources around the forming of the Hernandez School. There's a lot of focus of resources around the Chinatown mothers and the work that they were doing around bilingual education for their children. So those primary sources, I think, are particularly helpful. But I also think what's really powerful is this history, is that so many of the people involved in this history are still with us. And so really, this is this place where bringing people in is so important. When I taught at the McCormick, my colleague Justine Grace, her parents were guidance counselors in the Boston Public Schools. Stephen Grace was at Hyde Park High, and Mrs. Grace was at South Boston High, and they would come every year to talk about like what was it like to be teachers in the school system in that moment. I also was lucky to have started my career as a teacher with a group of Latino teachers who came to Boston in the late 70s and early 80s in order to sort of meet the increasing demands around the needs for language support for Latino students. Having them talk about what was it like to come from Puerto Rico and to come to teach at the McCormick, which was at in some ways sort of at the center of this story, has been really powerful. And so I think they're the best resource, and they're here. Like, we can do that, and we really should be doing that as much as we can.
So it's interesting. I work in the Healy Library and the University Archives. We have archival collections that document a range of things, and one of those areas of focus we have is related to school desegregation in Boston. So we actually, I think, are coming to our education work in the archives from a very different perspective. We're actually we are mostly doing like teaching around school desegregation. And the primary goal is to get students to engage with archival materials and then to hopefully go deeper. Our engagement is, we often aren't seeing students more than once. Until actually more recently, which I'll talk about in a moment. So we're often kind of trying to identify materials that we can use to introduce students to archival research. Materials that are pretty easily understood, which is very difficult with school desegregation in Boston. Finding materials that, that overview at the beginning was incredibly helpful because it is such a complex story or series of stories. So in the archives, we actually, the resource-wise, we focus our education using a few different collections that we have, and these were actually recommended to us. About 10 years ago, we started using these specific collections because of recommendations from Boston Public Schools and Boston Public Schools teachers who were looking for materials. And in the archives at UMass Boston, we have the Chambers papers of Judge Arthur Garrity, who, of course, ordered the schools to be desegregated. We have his Chambers papers. That's not the official court record, but 3 sections of that collection is correspondence with public figures and political leaders in the area. We have his collection of about of thousands of letters that were sent to him by community members and people around the country and around the world, kind of expressing their opinion about his decision, about the work and what he was doing, and then we also have a set of records, observer reports. So reports by observers who were hired and worked in the schools, and they had to fill out a form every day saying how many students were missing from school, what was the atmosphere like in the school. So we use these 3 sets of records really just to give students a chance to dive in, but also to see that there's 3 sets of records and 3 very different perspectives of what was happening. So I think for our piece, with college students, trying to get them to see this as something that they can dive into and learn more about, that an hour and a half is not going to, you're not going to understand the complexity of this. People are, Nick and Chris showed 3 books. There are many, many more that have been written and that should be written. We also have worked resource-wise with Northeastern, with other archival institutions in the area to try to get them to basically identify archival materials that can be used in the classroom, in college level, but also in K-12 classroom. And then the last thing I'll say about this is more recently, over the past 3 or 4 years, we've had faculty at UMass who have actually started coming in with their classes for multiple visits and actually digging deeper into our collections, digging deeper into this topic and exploring it on a deeper level, which has been really kind of a joy for us to be able to help make possible. Because I think from our perspective, we're more kind of in this service to try to make it possible for people to have these conversations and to do this research and understand the history of this more.
Sorry. Thanks, Andrew. And so I want to also, if anyone here is a UMass Boston colleague, I want to strongly urge you to get to our archives and work with Andrew and their team, because it is an incredible experience for your students. We have worked in my classes with these collections. So I've got the next question. I wanted to ask this because this is something I think about in my teaching, which is, what knowledge, if any, do your students bring into your classroom of this history, whether it's from their families, their communities, the sort of wider public presentations of this? And then, as a kind of follow-up, how do you both sort of prepare for this to come into your classroom, and how do you process these narratives and this knowledge with them?
I think it's important to just always remember that students never come into your classroom as empty vessels. They have a wealth of gifts and knowledge. And I think for me, the biggest thing for many of my students is really understanding skill first. The skill of being able to critically analyze visuals, being able to participate in deep conversations, learning how to be able to assess primary and secondary sources. So my 8th graders, their analytical abilities are impeccable at this point. But when it comes to content, understanding the kids that I served, the community that I served and lived in all my life, it is so important to recognize that many of my students are already connected because they live in Boston, that their family is from Boston. They're connected because Boston is their community. I conduct this activity where I show this blank map of Boston, and I have kids sort of kind of identify different neighborhoods. And the kids are so excited. I know East Boston, my mother lives there. So immediately, that activity excites them because it allows them to see themselves in the lesson. And so for me, those personal connections, that's what fosters a more deeper understanding of the content to sort of kind of get them prepared for what they're going to be learning about.
So I would briefly, did you?
Pushing the mic closer.
So briefly for us, it's interesting because we're mostly seeing students for an hour or an hour and a half. So it's interesting, like, I'm hesitant to ask a lot of questions that we're not going to have time to unpack. And it's actually been something that I think we've wrestled with a bit. Is we want students to be engaging with difficult materials, with materials that are challenging, but it's also, there's a part of me that's like, should we be engaging, having students work with these materials that are, they're not fun. Like they're very troubling. The correspondence from the public, but is can be troubling. But also the letters that public officials, that Louise Day Hicks was sending to Judge Garrity. It's these very controversial, really problematic, and racist letters. And so we're often kind of like, do we want to share these materials? But we're like, we're going to trust our students to, be up for the challenge of this. So I think it's interesting. We don't often ask too many questions. I think the question that I occasionally ask is, are you surprised that about 1974 being the year that Boston's public schools were desegregated? And I would say some students are surprised, some are not surprised at all. So, and that's something I was interested in.
I had to learn this through experience because I'm not from here. So I moved up here, and as part of my sort of teacher training, had to learn about this. Yeah, sure. I had to learn this history after I came here. It wasn't history I knew, and so I didn't have a lot of assumptions about what kids did or didn't know. But my first year teaching, I had Michael Patrick McDonald's book, All Souls, on my bookshelf. And I had a student in my class who was like, Miss, my mom's in that book. And then the next year, I was teaching Morgan versus Hennigan, and one of my students said, Tallulah Morgan was my grandma. And for me, it was just like, kind of my brain was exploding of like, yeah, there is so much relational knowledge that young people are holding relative to this history. Like, I'm the newbie here, they know a lot, right? There's one group of students in our schools who are they're the descendants, they're in the lineage of this history in many different ways. We also have students in our schools who are brand new to the country, for whom they have not much of this knowledge because it's not something they learned where they lived previously. And we're also doing this work in a city that I think has often erased and silenced a lot of this history. You know, you go to Little Rock, Arkansas, JD is here, and he's from Little Rock, so he knows if anyone's been there. You can't throw a rock in Little Rock without seeing some acknowledgement of the history of desegregation in Little Rock. The high school is a high school, but it's also a national park, and there's a visitor center, and there is a giant memorial, right? You go anywhere in the South, and I actually think the South is complicated in lots of ways, but in terms of acknowledging their history and commemorating it and putting up visible markers to it, they're way ahead of the game compared to us. There is no marker in this city that acknowledges the history and the legacies of desegregation in Boston. We have a pear at the corner of Columbia Road and Mass Ave. And I know there was an orchard and we're trying to acknowledge the history of the orchard, but like that's also where all the buses were going back and forth, and we could have made a choice to put a bus there. Or we could have made a choice to do anything there that would like recognize this history, and we choose not to as a city. So I think it's hard as an educator to hold all three of those things in your classroom at the same time. Young people who have a wealth of knowledge about this, young people who have very little to no knowledge, and a structural environment where like if you're doing the work of building that knowledge, like you're doing it, but it's not like the city necessarily is actively trying to support us in holding and sharing that history together.
Thank you. The next question we have is, how do your students react to learning about desegregation busing in Boston? Is this historical event relevant to Boston students today? Do students view the city as making progress since this period or not?
Well, I like to share my own experience of being bussed out of my neighborhood. The court-appointed order, from my understanding, was over in 1988. 1988, I was in the 4th, 5th grade. And I had to leave my neighborhood school, Dorchester, to go to West Roxbury. And I kind of shared that experience with a lot of my students. I didn't really understand the difference. I knew that none of my teachers looked like me. I knew that my mother was pissed off that I had to get up early in the morning to get on the bus and go to school all the way out in West Roxbury. I also like to share the story of my aunt. She was a part of the significant history. So she comes in and she shares stories. She went to Hyde Park High, and she talks about how there were days she had to run for her life. There were bottles being thrown at her. She experienced a lot of racial slurs. So I think that sparks a lot of interest in my students and a lot of empathy. And it promotes a lot of thoughtful questions. My students, Miss Milton, do you know Rosa Parks? And I'm like, oh God, no. But the biggest question that I find that most of my students always ask is, why didn't Boston Public Schools just fix the neighborhood schools? Why did you have to travel so far? Do you think busing work? And so if I can get my kids to ask those questions and we dig a little deeper and just trying to find the answers to it, I feel like I did my job, that part.
I always think it's really interesting for young people to see the visuals of Boston. So when I taught civics and we did Little Rock, and then after Little Rock we moved to Boston, and kids would see the sort of resistance in Little Rock and then see the resistance in Boston, it was very surprising for them to sort of see that parallel of like, we're not in Little Rock anymore, but the sort of like, and it's 20 years later, but like the resistance is here, right? I also think in Eyes on the Prize, this is especially like they have all those sort of B-roll scenes that are like the bus going down Dorchester Ave or the bus at the corner of Columbia Road. And I think for young people who live in Dorchester and South Boston, it can be kind of powerful to see places that you walk by all the time that are also part of this moment in history, and so there can be excitement there. There's one scene in Eyes on the Prize where there's a mom in Columbia Point talking about how her son gets left on the bus, and she's like, why can't he just go to the Dever? And my kids are always like, wait, the Dever right here, the Dever, right? Like there is some real power in like learning a history that's of the place that you are from. And then I think that I could never leave it. I can never leave it as a teacher ever. I'm not able to. So like I couldn't leave it with busing. Like I had to bring us to now. So the last part of my unit, this unit that starts with like, what are the origins of race and racism in this country? The end was always, well, let's look at our schools now. What's the data? Where are we at when it comes to issues of racial segregation? Where are we at when it comes to questions around academic performance? Where are we at around suspension rates, right? And to let kids sort of continue to grapple with the fact that that big question, that question around educational quality for all young people, like, we have done all these things, we're still fighting for that. We still haven't answered that question. And so I think that's kind of where we try to end, is that like we're also part of this fight. Like we're also part, like this is the legacy that we're trying to carry forward, is the legacy of continuing to have this demand for the education they deserve.
So picking up on this one's on, right? Y'all can hear me? It's hard to distill this, right? And that's always the challenge of a lesson. You have a unit, you have limited times on how to bring this vast history together. And so this is, I almost think this question is unfair, but is there a most important idea or concept or takeaway? Is there something, and you all have alluded to this already, that you really want students to walk away from these lessons, this history with? Is there a kind of, a takeaway, I think is the right word. I don't know that there's one, but maybe a couple.
Well, I mean, I think learning that organizing struggles are long and iterative, and that like, okay, we tried this, and this got us this little bit, but then we got hit here, so then we had to try this other thing, right? We tried the Freedom Schools, we tried Operation Exodus, we tried Metco, we tried this. Like, I think it's important for young people to see that like that is the nature of struggle, and that is the nature of organizing, that it's not the one-off. We fought, we won, it's over, is not a narrative that really is true in our country. And so I think seeing a community keep coming back again and again and again, and keep innovating and trying different things and trying new things, and sort of holding true to like, this is what we believe and we're going to keep fighting for it. I think there's a lot for young people to learn in that model, right? Of like, this isn't about fast solutions, it's not about quick solves, it's like, this is deep work, it's relational work, it's community work, it's ongoing, and we keep doing it. I feel like that for me is the most important thing kids can take away.
I got several takeaways. While the intent was to improve educational opportunities for Black students, did this policy effectively aim to integrate schools? Could there have been another solution? We start looking at METCO, start looking at some of the things where students start saying, well, being bused to better resource schools were great, but why are we not addressing some of the challenges within our own communities? So students start researching some of the inequities within their own communities. But I have to talk about the impact of the decision. It's really important for students to see the social unrest. Many white families resisted change. They need to see the protests, the violence, highlight some of the racial tensions within many Boston communities. That's something I can't not show my kids or have them understand. So the reaction of this decision was very, very, very profound, to the point where students are like, well, it seems as if the civil rights movement didn't just stop when the Brown versus Board of Education decision was made. So for me, I like for students to kind of figure out ways of how could they address effective ways to kind of address systemic racism. What are some of the challenges that they currently see now that they can sort of kind of fight to kind of fix the problems within their school community? So those are some of the takeaways.
I guess I've already mentioned that I want students to kind of come away seeing this as something that is complex and that they can dive into and learn more and study. But as everybody else was talking, I was thinking more and more about the thing we try to kind of foster happening in our instruction sessions with students is for them to see themselves in the records a bit more. So that, if there's there's organizing happening. These aren't just Judge Garrity. Desegregation did because it happened because of Judge Garrity. It did not happen because Mel King is a person or G. McGuire did something. It happened because these community members did like rose up and did all of these things, just normal people trying to live better lives and have better lives. And I think when we can find materials in our collections that students can kind of see that, that's kind of what I want them to come away seeing, that they can also contribute to some kind of the, like Will Melking has the chain of change, it's that they can be part of that.
Next question. Okay. The story of busing in Boston often centers resistance to desegregation by white parents, students, residents, politicians. Yet there were a range of reactions, including many people who supported busing, as well as a range of different integration efforts. How do you center the voices of Black Bostonians as well as integration supporters? Do you include other communities in your lessons on busing, such as Latinos or Asian Americans? How do you present a more complex narrative about the era?
I didn't get that question. I'm just.
Oh, I fell off the seat.
So I'm gonna have you go.
All right. So I think that's really important, and like I think, Tanisha, I think you're absolutely right about like needing to be really honest about the resistance and be very clear about what it looked like, because I think we're currently living in a moment where there were some people who did not estimate the level of resistance that would exist to change, and we're gonna live with the results of that, right? So if you don't ever get to look at it and see it and acknowledge that it's real, that's not doing you a favor either. If you're a young person, you have to know that that is a very real thing. And I think it's a question of ratio a little bit, right? So it's not about, I'm gonna take one story out and put the other story in and not talk about both things, but I do think it's a question of how much, right? I think for a very long time in this city, the quantity of narrative around this history has been largely around white grievance and resistance to change. That is the preponderance of the story. I think that's actually a really interesting difference between The Busing Battleground, which is the newer documentary, and Eyes on the Prize. In some ways is like, in Eyes on the Prize, Ruth Batson gets, I think, 2 minutes, maybe 3 in the entire episode 2. And she's really at the heart of The Busing Battleground. Like, her story is told in such a fuller way that's so much more representative of like 25 years of work prior to Garrity's decision that she was doing. So that's it, right? It's how much weight do we put where? And in that same way, it's like in the body of like in talking about sort of these long legacies of organizing and resistance, is there also room to talk about how more recent immigrant communities entered into that conversation? What were opportunities for solidarity? Were they missed because there weren't really strong mechanisms for building that solidarity across groups? Like, I think there is a way to tell that story and center those voices without making it kick one out to put the other in, but rather just being really intentional about where we put the weight in the story.
For our piece, I think this is kind of at the heart of what we try to do in the archives at UMass Boston. Archives across the city are trying to do around school desegregation is, so UMass Boston has the Judge Garrity's Chambers papers. We also have the records of the Center for Law and Education. They were the organization that served as co-counsel in the case. But we also have but then we acquired the papers of Ione Malloy, who was a teacher at South Boston High School, who published a memoir based on her diaries. And from those, we've started to try to collect more personal stories. We have the scrapbook of a woman who's actually a faculty member here at UMass Boston, who had a scrapbook. She was a student in Hyde Park, and she just kept a scrapbook of what it was like for her. And then Friday, I was working on an oral history collection that was donated by activist and educator Lida Peters. I'm wondering if she's actually here. But it's an oral history she did for research in, I think, 2012, focusing on interviewing Black leaders in the city of Boston who kind of were part of the activist work between the 1950s and the 1970s. So really trying to get at the kind of what, these personal narratives of what was happening, instead of just these dry organizational legal records, and making this more personal stories. I think it's, we've been trying, that's kind of the business of like an archives, is trying to all of these different voices in a room yelling at each other archivally.